Because expressive freedom is the oxygen of both. Artists need to be able to express themselves. Democracy needs to be able to air opposing views. Trial by what is contrary, to quote John Milton, is the essence of peer review in academia. It's the essence of, it's the only way we'll get to the closest version of truth we can ever get to.
It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be having this conversation with Ira in a library and be having the conversation in the Jack Rabinovich room. Jack was a great book person, and it couldn't be a better setting for this, in my opinion. On Book Burning is many things. It's cogent, provocative, generous, fair-minded, quietly insistent, and quietly polemical. It's also wonderfully written. There is much to discuss, and we only have about 40 minutes before we open it up to questions. Ira and I have decided that some of the deeper background, historical material in the book you can discover for yourselves, and we're instead going to focus on the urgent now. And we have vowed that if possible, the urgent now will not include Trump until the 40th minute, or 30. If you happened to see Ira's piece in the Globe and Mail this weekend, he is actually encouraging us to take time out from Donald Trump. So we're going to do that for at least half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. We're going to move through 5 battlegrounds around censorship, the new censorship, and keeping in mind, to some extent, the very provocative subtitle of this book, which is on how the new censorship consensus trivializes art and undermines democracy. And that's where we hope to get to in 40 minutes. Ira, I'm going to open by asking you to, first of all, on the opening assumption that book censorship is on the rise, simply question why, and what definitions do we need to pin down to have this conversation? Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. It's a great honor to share the mic with you tonight. Book censorship is on the rise. Book banning is on the rise. It is coming from 2 different directions. It is coming from largely from parents' rights organizations that you may have heard of in places like Florida. These groups are like No Left Turn in Education or Moms for Liberty, and they were COVID-era anti-government organizations that coalesced around the issue of largely LGBTQ books in school libraries. And the way that they frame the issue is that these books are indoctrination, and they're child pornography, and they need to be eliminated from school libraries. You may have seen the raucous 7-hour marathon school board sessions where they show up and create a fuss. They are engaged in all kinds of other charming behavior, like threatening to sue people who have those little free libraries that you may have seen around. So if you have a little free library that has something they deem obscene, they encourage people to take legal action on that front. They harass librarians. They bully teachers. They try and get books off of reading lists, and that is their MO. So that's let's call that the sort of populist evangelical mode of book banning. And then there was what happened in Peel region in 2023. So this was when progressive educators in Ontario urged upwards of 50% of the libraries. We can talk in more detail about this, but in Peel region for very different reasons. They were arguing that many of these classic works of literature or older works of literature were inherently Eurocentric, inherently heteronormative, and were harmful to children. So what struck me about this is that there are these 2 different sides of book banning. I call it this
censorship consensus who appear to be exactly the opposite. You couldn't imagine people who are more dissimilar than progressive educators in Ontario and evangelicals in Florida, and yet they both have come to the same conclusion, which is that books and libraries are sources of contagion that that are harmful to children, and that the answer is to liquidate the books that you don't like.
Are they under the impression they're censors?
No, they absolutely will not accept that. And so let's just nail down what book banning is. So book banning, according to the American Library Association, is the removal of a book from a library because someone finds it harmful. Sometimes it's because it's morally objectionable. But that's what book banning is. It's the removal of a text that has been chosen and is already on the shelf because it is morally offensive to them.
Can you legitimately distinguish between censorship and just banning a book? Or in your, as your title, because your title is on book banning, but the thrust of your argument is around censorship as a reality, for you, is there any distinction there that would legitimate one but not the other?
So I think that book banning is a form of censorship. I feel compelled in the book to stay pretty focused on book banning, just because the issue of censorship is enormous. To write a book about censorship on the internet, for example, would be something else entirely. Mm-hmm. And I think that in my modest way, I would just hope that not throwing books out of libraries is something we could agree on. It just feels a bit more like manageable. Right. So I think that's why I wanted to keep the focus on book banning.
Before we move into the contemporary battlefields around, in this area, is the impulse in human beings to censor strong, and is it innate? Is it always going to be with us? Or is there something new here?
Yeah, that's a deep question. I do think that there is an ineradicable impulse to censor in human beings, and that it's a counterintuitive idea, something that we have to learn to think about why is it that you should say something, you should have the right to say something that I find offensive, wrong, or more, or even beyond that. Why is it that you should have the right to say that? I don't think that's something that children understand naturally. I think it's something that many parents can and many educators can talk themselves out of after they accept that everything is inherently politicized and political, and it's just about the exertion of power. But there's a lot of history in the book that we won't rehash. But I think largely the answer to that question is that you have the right to say what we need to give you the right to say what you want, not only because it's your right to do so, but because it's my right to hear. It's my right to know what you think, even if I am horrified by what's on your mind. That's
a principle. The practice is often to opt for social control, though. And I guess what I'm asking you before we dive in is that baked into our DNA? Or do we have better angels that can lift us up?
Well, I think that I should say that the impulse to censor is, I think, ubiquitous. Our institutions can act as safeguards, and we need to ensure that those institutions, which include libraries, which include norms like free expression, freedom of speech, these things are safeguards that allow liberal democracies to persist. And that as we continually, or as we see these norms and these institutions being eroded in small ways, libraries that are throwing their books out, or people who no longer accept expressive freedom as just a general value, that leads to larger issues down the road.
And we'll swing back around at the very end to the subtitle's inference regarding liberal democracy and free speech and the avoidance or contesting of censorship. Let's start with the first battleground, a very local one, very personal one for you as a parent. Can you begin by just situating us in these couple of experiences you had around an audit at the elementary school of your kids and around the equity toolkit that you were briefly involved with, and how this came to trigger or at least start the conversation in your mind about writing this book?
Yeah. So as you say, not all great adventures begin with an email from your principals, from the school principal, but this one did. It was an email that came from the principal of my children's school that said that the school was undertaking what they called a library audit. And by this point, we'd already heard a number of stories coming out of places like Florida. This was sort of mid-pandemic, I would say. And we'd heard about the book banning that was on the rise in Florida and elsewhere. And I wondered if library audit wasn't the kind of innocuous sounding language, the guise through which censorship would come to Toronto. I was curious about that. It just seemed a little unusual, that phrase. I signed up for the committee, and we essentially the small parent committee converged in the library, and we were given something called the TDSB Equity Toolkit, and were asked to start pulling books more or less at random, and then use the toolkit to evaluate these texts. The toolkit asks questions like, are children's identities affirmed in the text? Does the text give children the opportunity to resist the status quo? Yes or no questions. There's 17 yes or no questions, all of which, to my mind, serve to largely boil away the imaginative quality of literature and sort of reduce it to its political content. But regardless, we engaged in this process, and it was, you have to imagine you're sort of sitting in these little chairs in a kid's library, and you're actually not that dissimilar from this. Your knees are sort of up around your head. And the principal just kind of joked a little bit at the end of this meeting that she wished she could just get rid of all the old books. Just sort of said,
And the old books meaning what in her mind, as you understood it?
So she had an illustrated children's book that she was using as an example, and we were just sort of looking at this book kind of uncomprehendingly and not really understanding what the issue was. And then she pointed out that it was about a family, and the family had a male father and a female mother, and that the characters were white. And she said that with some exasperation that the library was just full of this stuff, and it would be her preference to just get rid of it. And I thought she was joking. I thought that, or at least I hope she was joking. But the next fall, there was a grade 10 student named Raina Takata. Raina Takata went to Arundel Secondary School probably still does, in Mississauga. And she noticed that she's a book person, a kid who spent a lot of time in the library, and she arrived in September and noticed that half the books were gone from the library. And this upset her, and she blew the whistle. And we still don't know the full details of what happened in Peel Region in the fall of 2023, but we do know that thousands of books were liquidated from the libraries. That we know two things about this. One is that they had eventually settled upon the year 2008. That 2008 was going to be the cutoff for anything before that was removed. And secondly, that because these books were deemed harmful, they were not donated to families in need. They were not sent to communities that could have used them, but were just sort of quickly boxed up like toxic waste and disposed of.
2008, on book burning, you give some fairly random examples of books that would have not made the cut, and to say the least, they wouldn't have all been by dead white males. So this book this criteria, however intended, had unintended consequences in your mind, as do all these efforts, perhaps.
Well, one of the books that was called was and the Diary of Anne Frank. So as part of an equity-based weeding process, Anne Frank was thrown out. Reina Takata, who is from Japanese Canadian family, pointed out that the books on the Japanese internment in Canada were likely gone. And I think that the educators and administrators in Peel Region think, well, these books will just be replaced. But the Canadian publishing, the children's publishing world in Canada cannot replace libraries of books every 15 years, nor would we want to. But it's going to make us much more dependent upon American publishers. Our own history will be lost, and we'll be trapped within a perpetual present. Children will never have read the same books as their parents. The sort of lack of historical perspective here is kind of staggering.
You speak as well of implications or unintended consequences around notions of autonomy of mind in education. What did you mean by that phrase in the book?
Well, I think that if freedom means anything in a liberal democracy, and sorry if this sounds pompous and bombastic, this was the kind of thing I couldn't say in that elementary school library because it just sounded ridiculous. It feels a bit better here. But if within a liberal democracy, freedom means the ability to cultivate your own mind, if it means anything at all. It means the ability to think the kinds of thoughts that you want to think, to grow into being the kind of person that you want to be, to inform your own thinking with books that you want to read. And the desire for a censor to intervene and to say, I know better than you what you should be reading, or I know what your kid should be reading. And you may think it's okay for your kid to read this, but I know better. That is fundamentally illiberal. It's not only undemocratic, but it is illiberal. It's down the road of thought control.
How far down the road?
Not too many stops left.
Let's move on to the second battleground you and I have identified, which is libraries, right here, right now, where we are this evening. Both progressives and conservatives, and I think that's how we'll just, for purposes of this conversation, we'll distinguish between the far left and maybe the far right in this dialogue, see libraries as microcosms of society. Is this true?
I think it's true that they see them as microcosms of society, in the sense that, you know, my read on this is that whether it's the progressive educators or whether it's the evangelicals, the conservatives, they think of libraries as a little laboratory for a more perfect society, in which the books are levers, right? So if you want a little, if you're a sort of conservative and you're not a fan of wokeness, you might say, well, we should have some more Socrates and some more Shakespeare, and we'll pull those levers, or we'll include more of those books. We'll pull some of the other books, or conversely, you might be pulling other books for other reasons. So I think that there's a temptation to see libraries as these kind of microcosms of society. But of course, as we know, books don't change people's behavior all that well. I mean, do you think, based on writing about Richler and do you think that people's behavior mirrors books in this mimetic way, in this one-to-one way?
No, I don't. I think it's a lovely compliment. But it's excessive and overdone, and we should only wish. And this pushback onto you, Ira, brings me to this next point. What are the implications of thinking about books in this censorship frame? What are the implications for you as an educator, as a lover of books, as a teacher of books, for our understanding of them if we view them as a place where this set of values or that set of values are either extolled or critiqued? Mm-hmm. Besides being reductionist, what else might it be?
I would say just really clearly off the bat that I think that any kid should be able to go into a library and see themselves reflected in the pages of on those shelves. I think that we should pay attention when people from LGBTQ communities and BIPOC communities tell us that it means something to see themselves reflected in literature, and our libraries have to be diverse and they have to give kids those opportunities. Book banners would take away those opportunities. They would, and book banning doesn't necessarily just work by totally eliminating a book from all of society. That's not how it works, right? Book banning can work by just keeping a book out of a kid's hands at a particularly impressionable life stage, at a point when it really would have meant something to them to have that book and then not have that experience. It can also work to allow a political community to converge upon a scapegoat and to say, to enact a kind of symbolic violence, right? In a sense that we're going to generate our own community in opposition to the people that do not belong. And so I think it's really important to push back against that and to ensure that that the libraries are truly inclusive spaces. But I think it's also important to understand that people read for different reasons and children read for different reasons. Some children read to see themselves reflected in the pages of books and need that. Other children thrive in experiences of otherness and need and find that totally fruitful and productive to imagine something that they've never encountered before. And others just want imaginative flights of fancy. And that's what they need, that escape. And I think libraries are wonderful places because they can provide all of those ways of engaging with literature.
Early on book banning, you suggest, quote, attacks on school libraries are, among much else, future-oriented attacks on liberal democracy and its vital institutions. Future-oriented. Why future-oriented?
Because we're fighting about what narratives kids can have in their heads as they grow up and as they become who they're going to be. We're fighting about the narratives that they'll have in their heads over that period of time. I think that libraries have been important institutions within liberal democracies for the past 250 or 300 years. They were an important source of education at a time when the education system, there was no mandatory education. They were an important mechanism for social uplift, for self-fashioning, and for education. Some people will now say, look, all that's being done on the internet, right? We don't need libraries anymore because if you want to just Google, if you want to Google Benjamin Franklin's autobiography or whatever, supposed important text you want to read, you'll just find it on the internet. And I think this is really naive in two ways. One is that the internet is not free, right? We know this. There's a organization called Freedom House that measures web freedom around the world. Freedom House will tell you that it changes every year, but right now there are something like 18 or 19 countries that actually have a free internet. And the countries that have a free internet right now will not always have a free internet. That's not the way the world is going. So the idea that we're just going to put our books online, we don't need libraries anymore. I think that would-be authoritarians want nothing more, or would love nothing more than libraries that they can just unsubscribe, right? We know that libraries have come under cyber attacks. Libraries have been shut down because of cyber attacks. You may have heard of something called the Open Library, which opened during COVID. They made all kinds of books available to users for free. They were then sued by 5 major publishers, and then something like 500,000 books just disappeared from the internet. So the idea that we can just put our books online and that's great, that is, I think, a dangerous idea. I think we should remind ourselves that libraries have a really important role to play in preserving books, preserving knowledge, and that we need to stand behind our librarians who are themselves standing up for intellectual freedom.
Ira, you may want to have a sip of water now, because I'm going to ask you, as we move on to our next battleground, to offer an impossibly brief summary of critical race theory. Because I think in order to understand the section on book burning that talks about the ways that the academy has become a battleground, not necessarily in and of itself, those ideas are important and have a profound effect on universities, but more how they've been translated into the wider society. Could you help us by just explaining a little what critical race theory meant, say 30, 40 years ago, and how it moved from this dynamic space of interrogation into maybe having influences that were also unintended on things like book banning and censorship?
Sure. So first of all, I would just say that the term critical race theory has become so politicized and so abused in public discourse that usually when you see someone in the media talking about critical race theory, that they're using it as a boogeyman. They usually, shouldn't say always, but usually they don't appear to have actually engaged with the thinkers or the ideas. But let me just back up a minute. I mean, I mentioned that in 2023, Peel Region liquidated thousands of books from their shelves. I think that strikes many of us as a somewhat odd idea, or I was surprised by it. Let's just say that. So where does that come from? What kind of belief system has to be in place so that you feel that that's a good idea? And I think you don't get to that. You don't get to the book liquidation moment without the belief that words wound. And there's a history to that idea. And in fact, one of the first works of critical race theory is called Words That Wound. It came out in 1993. It was written by Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and a couple of other scholars. And if I could reduce that to a couple of big ideas, that text, it is that, as the title may have clued you in on, words wound in a very real way. They looked at specific examples of assaultive speech. This is like the most heinous, directly offensive, assaultive speech that you can imagine, and argued that that kind of speech causes actual physiological problems in people, that it stresses your body out, that it causes health implications, and also that, and then secondly, that there needed to be legal recourse, that there had to be, there had to be a way of regulating that speech. I think that the way that those ideas trickled down to places like libraries in Ontario, in school libraries, was to take the idea that words can wound and detach it, sadly, from the very specific ways in which the critical race theorists were using it, so that they're no longer talking about assaultive speech. They're talking about words, printed words in a novel from the 19th century, or in other kinds of contexts. In other words, that we lose the distinction between the direct, assaultive, insulting nature of words that wound, and it becomes something much more subjective, something much more subjective, in the sense that if you are offended by where else is the wound to be found than in the subjective experience of the person who is being wounded? And then once you give people that sort of veto power, what makes one category of wounding words more real and more important than another? Mm-hmm. And then just very, very briefly, I think that the other upshot here is that the term harm gets, so harm can cover everything from like actual PTSD style harm to something that's mildly uncomfortable, right? And harm gets invoked as this kind of blanket category in these conversations. So we'll say this book is a source of harm in a way that the person who's making that declaration almost never has to say like where the harm comes in, or how it's harmful, or where the harm registers, but rather it's harmful, and that doesn't get unpacked.
Yes. And you're very clear in the book that systemic racism is real, and critical race theory has highlighted and brought to the fore many baked in inequalities and things that absolutely need to be addressed. What you also want to make clear is that it was taken up rather clumsily, if earnestly, by book banners, and you call them CRT, critical race theory, adjacent ideas. And that's what you mean, I assume, by saying that you take a large, powerful concept like harm, and then you make it as subjective as feeling offended or feeling insulted by something. At which point you become a book banner.
Yeah, the Ontario School Library Association is very clear that a person making a book challenge isn't to refer to their own feelings as part of that challenge, that it has to be a sort of policy-based matter, because in a country that is as diverse and as pluralistic as Canada, many different groups will be offended by many different books. And once we assign a veto power to one group because they are upset by words that may be wounding, that power has to be granted to all, or the lack of fairness, the lack of equity will be noticed, and it will undermine people's faith in the system.
Can you censor your way out of history?
No.
Are the classics the problem?
I don't think the classics exist anymore in the same way. I think that most of us who've been involved in literary circles and education for a while would tell you that the definition of classic has opened up. It has changed. It now includes not just the dead old Europeans, but just a couple of words on classics. The book banners in Peel Region hate classics. They explicitly sort of signaled that the classics have to go, right? Because they are too Eurocentric, they're too heteronormative, and so on. And I think this is wrong for a couple of reasons. Very briefly, the first is that even if we do want to take the classics to mean just the canonical text of the Western canon, not that anyone agrees on those anymore, by the way. No one agrees on the canonical text of the Western canon. But even if you want to pick just Shakespeare, for example, Shakespeare has been interpreted in many different ways over hundreds of years. And if you were to flip through Shakespeare journals today, you will find that Shakespeare is being interpreted in post-colonial ways, in environmentalist ways, in LGBTQ ways. That one of the things that makes these classics so lasting is the fact that they are reinterpretable over time, and they're not reducible to a single message, right? These texts have stayed with us because they're not propaganda, and that's what the book banners want to turn them into, is just propaganda. Secondly, very briefly, is that the idea that BIPOC or historically marginalized communities cannot engage with the classics of the Western tradition is a very old and frankly racist idea. The idea that Socrates and Marcus Aurelius and all the rest, that's for the upper class, that's for upper class white kids, and the other people should think about vocational school or something more useful, spend their time in a more useful way. I mean, that's a really old, you don't need me to make this point. Ta-Nehisi Coates makes this point. He talks about how reading Macbeth while on the streets of Baltimore was a life-changing experience. W.E.B. Du Bois makes this point. Mm-hmm. African-American critics for a century have been making this point, that it's a demeaning idea to think that the classics are for white kids only.
We're going to move forward. We're at the 33-minute mark, so it's time to talk a little bit about our age, our moment. Post-war liberalism, you write, is giving away to other forms of, or so it seems, other kinds of government, other kinds of governance practices. We've stayed close to Canada, but Donald Trump has returned with a vengeance, And obviously DEI, which could be argued as sort of an extension of critical race theory, is under tremendous assault. And the assault from the far right around book banning that they view as righteous is growing. Is this as concerning as it seems?
So you may have missed in the flurry of news over the past few weeks. It's hard to believe it's been a month.
Just a month.
It's been 1 month.
Very long month, Ira. Yeah.
You could be forgiven for having missed that the Department of Education announced that they have ended Joe Biden's book ban hoax.
Explain that a little more, because I was interested, but I had forgotten about Joe Biden book ban hoax.
So the Joe Biden book ban hoax is the idea that there was no book banning ever happening. So Joe Biden had created a position, a role within the Department of Education to investigate all the book banning that had been going on, largely in places like Florida, but also in Texas and all over the place. And the Trump Department of Education, which maybe not much longer for this world, came out with an announcement saying that they were ending this book ban hoax. In other words, there was no book banning that was happening. It was all just a hoax. And why this is important, Charlie, is that, if you go back to you don't have to go back that far. This book goes back 2,000 years, but if you just go back, say 50 years or to the sort of mid-century, in about the 1950s, book banning was the censorship apparatus was still on the rise. Municipalities were still creating new censorship boards. The customs inspectors were still vigorously prosecuting prohibited books well into the 1980s and 90s, by the way, which I go into this in the book too. In Canada, there's a gay and lesbian bookstore called Glad Day Books on Church, oldest queer bookstore in North America. But they were routinely having their stuff searched and seized, and they were being harassed well into the 1980s. So, but there were a number of legal victories, a number of cultural changes, especially in the 1960s, that made especially sexuality more permissible in literature. There were technological changes. People weren't so worked up about books anymore. And so book banning got somewhat pushed to the margins, and it was taken up by organizations, anti-government organizations like Moms for Liberty, No Left Turn in Education, and so on. But it was largely not state-sanctioned, state-sponsored book banning. What I find interesting about this moment, Charlie, is that we now seem to be coming full circle in the sense that now the official Trump position is a very conspicuous wink to those organizations that what you're doing isn't book banning, go for it.
Could that happen here?
I think that what has been happening in Canada on this front has been about 3 years behind what's been happening in the United States. So if you look at what happened in Alberta 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it's called Deer Valley. There was a CBC investigation that revealed that they actually, some anti-book, anti-LGBTQ people shuttered a library. They essentially had it defunded in a community north of Edmonton quite recently, like within the past month or so. So yeah, these tactics are with us. They're here. Our librarians know very well that the challenges to intellectual freedom are with us. They're not to come. They're here. And that I just would repeat that we need to give our librarians our full support and to have their backs, because they're the ones who are protecting our intellectual freedom.
Ira, in the few minutes before we open up to questions, I just want to swing back to your subtitle and your contention that the new censorship trivializes art and undermines democracy. I feel like in choosing that, well, explain the subtitle to us. Why did you choose to, in a sense, represent both the literary and the citizenship side of this, more societal side?
Because expressive freedom is the oxygen of both. Artists need to be able to express themselves. Democracy needs to be able to air opposing views. Trial by what is contrary, to quote John Milton, is the essence of peer review in academia. It's the essence of, it's the only way we'll get to the closest version of truth we can ever get to, is by hearing people express the opposite and testing our own assumptions against that. There are countless grotesque episodes in human history where we have been so certain that the earth is at the center of the universe, or we've been so certain about the moral righteousness of residential schools, or we've been so certain about eugenics policies that we don't need to consider the other side. And we've learned this lesson enough. So we know that intellectual freedom is absolutely vital if you want a free artistic society, and it's also vital if you're interested in liberal democracy.